ask about that, and it slipped my mind. So we are now recording. Thank you. Okay.
Great, no worries, Cathy. Before I get started, I wanted to introduce my colleague. I would say coworker, but we're not in the same space ever anymore, so it's different. But Dayla Tipton is probably on the bottom of the screen somewhere. She's got the amend sign. Dayla is our deputy campaign manager, and I usually ask her if she can to join these for a couple of reasons. First, to make sure I don't miss anything, but also because she's the keeper of all of the information for Fair Maps. So if you have questions, need sites, need references, need anything about what we say, you know, she's the guru of that, and so she'll probably be posting in the chat room links to things as you need it. So let me walk through a couple. I wanted to think kind of three parts. One, what this proposed amendment does, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the past, but I think it's most important to focus on what's going to be on your ballot next Friday. Hopefully you're getting your ballot next Friday. What's on the ballot, who supports it, because I think that's really important at a time where we need to listen to experts. And then lastly, what are the biggest objections and kind of my takes on those objections. So let me tell you what the amendment does. The amendment is a bipartisan hybrid commission that would add transparency, fairness, and minority community protections into the state constitution for the first time ever. The current constitution, as it is right now, says the legislature shall draw districts in years ending in 1. It doesn't say they draw districts in years ending in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. It does say they have to draw them in years ending in 1. And throughout our history in Virginia, that simple little line has been more or less in every constitution, and it's allowed politicians to go behind closed doors, pick their voters. That's never been a feature of our democracy. In fact, Brent Tarter has written a great book on gerrymandering in Virginia. If you want to know about that, it's a spectacular book. And he's also endorsed this amendment, which is nice. He's a real good researcher at the Library of Virginia. And they've done but what's happened lately is that computer technology has kind of gone through the roof here. So the first time computers were ever really used in redistricting was the 1990s. Then they got better in the 2000s. 2011 was in hyperdrive, as you all can just think about the phone you had in your pocket then. And we're headed into 2021, and the technology, the good news is that more watchdog and government groups have that technology, but the technology to manipulate our maps is better than it's ever been. And so we're really faced with a problem that is as old as politics, but is also in an acute form that we've never seen it before. So that's kind of what we're faced with here. So the amendment creates a half citizen, half legislative conference, evenly balanced by parties. So there's even number of Republicans, even number of Democrats. And I can get into the selection process, but I want to say that I think there's 3 ways to evaluate a redistricting proposal. And I think the first way is, the first kind of chunk is, how independent is your commission? And I want as an independent a commission as humanly possible. I don't want any legislators on that. I want closer to what our friends in California, Michigan, and Colorado got, which is an independent commission. I don't say nonpartisan because every commission is made up of partisans in one way or another. But that's what I want. So the second block is, how does your commission protect communities, right? Are you just, can they just be divided all the time the same way they always have been, or are there protections in there for that? And then the third piece is, how transparent is the whole process? We want open meetings and open data. So here's what I think the amendment proposed scores. I think we get half of what we want on the independent commission. We get in a very important piece in our racial and ethnic minority community protections in the amendment itself. And because we have a tradition in Virginia of keeping our constitutional amendments really short, there's been subsequent enabling legislation that's passed that fills out the middle part. Senator McClellan, SB 717, if anybody wants to look it up. And then the last part is the transparency piece, and we really got pretty much whatever the full shebang there. So half good and the whole thing at the bottom. So it's not everything I want as a reformer, but we don't have the same luxury that our friends in Colorado and California and Michigan do, of having a citizens referendum and having to go through and having to skip the legislature. we have to go through the legislature, not once, but twice, to put something on the ballot for Virginians to vote on. And, so we had been trying for years to get redistricting reform, any kind of redistricting, just a transparency, a one line in the Constitution, just anything we possibly could. And I want to give a shout out to Delegate Mieres here, who was one of the few members of the House Republican caucus willing to break with this caucus early, way before this was cool, when they had almost a supermajority in the House of Delegates to actually support fair redistricting. So we had this kind of perfect storm in 2019 where the Republicans were largely on their way out. Everybody knew the Democrats were likely to win, so they passed this kind of even, Steven, fair, transparent redistricting. And then Democrats got in charge in 2020, and the momentum from being in the minority kind of carries it over. But so that's kind of the situation that we have. Let me move to the who supports this. This reform movement is not just special to Virginia. There are really, really awesome organizations all around the country working on this. One of my heroes in this is a woman named Katie Fahey out of Voters Not Politicians in Michigan. And she got it done in there. It's an amazing story. If you read the film Slay the Gerrymander, it's on demand. It'll make you cry. It's so good. And she's such a hero. So if you look at the folks that support these things, it's Common Cause, Campaign Legal Center, the Brennan Center for Justice, Princeton Gerrymandering Project, Unite America, Arnold Ventures. Those are the groups that are out there, Fair Vote, and they've all endorsed this. And I think that's important when it comes to complex issues that are, I'm not an expert in pandemics or epidemiology, but I still wear a mask because Dr. Fauci says to wear a mask. So, and I'm not saying you can't do your own homework, but if you're looking for homework, I would encourage you to not look at partisan blogs, but instead look at academic experts and good government groups that are fighting for this issue, not just in states where it might benefit their particular partisan leanings, but people that are fighting for this issue just as fiercely as they did in Utah, as they did in California, right? And if you look at those organizations, 100% of them support this amendment. All the statewide experts do, and I'm happy to have those folks on our team. The last bit I want to say are what are the two big objections here that we're facing. I think they fall into, there's a number of questions. Everybody has questions because the process is complicated. You're trying to put checks and balances in to make sure one team doesn't get over on the other and that we fairly do this. But I think they boil down into two buckets. One is the Supreme Court of Virginia is conservative and bad. And the other is trust us, we'll do better later, right? And I would say to the folks that are concerned about the Supreme Court of Virginia, if you are keeping score on any case that involves partisanship, there have been 6 of them this year. There's been 2 on the eviction moratorium, 1 on a mask order, 1 on a Second Amendment rights rally, 1 on Mayor Stoney in Richmond removing the statues, and then ours just recently about the ballot question. And in every case, all 6 of those, the Supreme Court of Virginia did what would be considered the Democratic position in that. So they're not, if you're looking for evidence that they're party hacks, I don't have any real evidence for you for that. And if you're wondering how courts draw maps, because that is the backstop if the commission deadlocks. If you're looking for how courts draw maps, I'll tell you that there's no example in this country's history of courts drawing a gerrymandered map. They always draw maps down the middle, kind of fair, neither party's too happy with it, but it's objectively neutral. So courts have a history of doing it pretty fairly. Legislatures have no history of ever doing it fairly. So I think that if you've got to pick a backstop to this commission, that the court is the better one. And the last thing I'll say is the kind of pinky promise that we'll do something better. I've fought for years on this issue. I know where the votes are and where the votes aren't. I know, how many folks in Delegate Mieres' caucus would support this if they were in the majority, and I know how many votes we have when the Democrats are in the majority. And so the problem is that to get the real improvement on the commission is to get a fully independent one, to get the legislators completely out of the process. And the problem is that's not on the table. And it's not, I'm personally a Democrat. It is not the Republicans' fault exclusively that this is not on the table, though there are plenty who don't believe in it. There are a lot of Democrats who also don't want legislators kicked off of the commission. Delegate Vivian Watts up y'all's way is one of them. And I think she's a wonderful delegate, nice person, but she tells me straight up that their legislators have special knowledge about their communities. They should be on the commission itself. Now, I disagree with that, but for folks telling you we can vote this down so we can get something better, I'll tell you that this is the most reform we can get right now. We need a lot of retirements or maybe some primaries or something to happen before we're able to take that next step. However, I do think, and this is the consensus of the reform expert community as well, if we get this amendment in place and you take it out of the smoky back room, you make it bipartisan, you make it transparent, then it's a little easier to take that final step and get it completely independent, right? Whereas if you start from zero, if we just don't have that, the Democrats are going to get very comfortable in power here shortly, or the pendulum's going to swing and the Republicans going to take it over, in which case everybody's going to start changing their calculus. And if you think the Democrats will do better in the future, if they get more entrenched and more comfortable in their majorities, then I just can't give you an example of where they've ever given up that power, right? If you look at Maryland or Illinois or Massachusetts, in California, where they had a citizens initiative, so they go around it. But in California, the Democratic Party endorsed against their redistricting reform too. So it's just, there's no example of the Democrats ever giving up power willingly or the Republicans ever too, which is why that perfect storm in 2019 and 2020 was so important. And we got the most reform to ever get through a state legislature without the threat of a ballot initiative on the back end. So probably have talked too long, but Cathy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate that. And we have a sense of background as well as current situation. So Jerry Kohlenberger, who is a member of the Faith and Public Policy Committee, is going to introduce our next speakers.
Thanks, Cathy, and thank you, Brian. That was a very good overview, I think, of the amendment. It does appear, if you go online and look at the information on the amendment, it does appear to have bipartisan support on the one hand, and certainly those that are opposed on the other. Clear bipartisan type of an issue. My first speaker that I'd like to introduce today is a delegate from Virginia Beach named Jason Miyares. Jason became a delegate in 2015. He is the son of a Cuban refugee who came here in 1965, his mother. He's lived and resided in Virginia Beach, it appears to be most of his life. Went to JMU for undergraduate and then got a law degree at William & Mary. Has been involved in lots of different community affairs in the Hampton Roads area, as a wife and 3 children. And we're just delighted to have you here as a representative in our state government, Jason. The second speaker that we have is also an expert in redistricting, as far as I can see. His name is Chris Marston. Chris is a founder of a company called Election CFO, which provides financial and compliance services to various different campaigns, committees, tax-exempt organizations, and PACs. And was very involved in the last round of Virginia redistricting. So he can give you firsthand what it was like in 2010 to 2012, should you have any questions. Chris resides in Alexandria, has been involved again in numerous different nonprofits, also has worked on such things as the Republican National Lawyers Association, where he's on the advisory board, worked as a general counsel of the Republican Party of Virginia as well, and also attends a Presbyterian church, which is nice for us to know about in Alexandria today, where he lives. We welcome both Jason and Chris, and Jason, if I may ask you to first, please give your perspective on the amendment, and we welcome your comments, and then we'll follow up with Chris.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you all. I've attended Presbyterian churches through college and through most of my adult life. I do go to a Galley Episcopal now, but it's great to be with friends and obviously this is a critically important topic. I want everybody to be aware I am going to have to jump off shortly after 10 because my daughter, she's on my mug, my oldest daughter is having a ballet performance this morning. And so I'm very proud to have dad duties that will call me away from you all. But I think from an 80,000 feet view, almost from if I could just touch on a faith perspective, I think we all recognize that right now our system currently is broken. I got asked the other day to speak to a church group about the intersection of faith and politics. And I thought of the great verse from Paul's magnificent letter to the Romans in chapter 12, where he says, when possible, be at peace with all men. And that's the great challenge, right? For those of us that are in the public arena, how do you balance that when it seems, if we turn on the nightly TV, that you have a lot of people that seem to be more interested in shouting at each other than trying to actually solve big problems. So I think from a very 80,000 feet view, I think we all recognize there's a lot about our current system that is broken. And I can't remember whether it's Abraham Lincoln or C.S. Lewis who said, if you want to test a man's character, give him political power. And you somewhat see that as well. I think it's really hard, whichever party's in power, to say no to the party leadership and the people in power. And as Brian kind of alluded, and Brian really has been at the front lines on this. I remember shortly after I got elected, which I really didn't know much about this issue, to be quite frank with you, Brian was one of the first people that came to see me and started kind of educating me a lot on this issue. And when you vote, as I did, I was on the Privileges and Election Committee and voted for redistricting reform. I suddenly found myself no longer on the Privileges and Election Committee. So that I know the pressure that happens, and I know when you put this kind of power, which is enormous, and John Kasich, Governor Kasich had a good line where he said, your hard work and your merit should be determining winning elections. And I think Brian alluded to our system right now has gotten so advanced that people are really good at drawing these maps. In fact, Brian was sharing with me that there is a map of a House of Delegate district that literally goes right through a parish church up in, I think it's Culpeper. And so both sides have gotten really, really sophisticated at this. And I guess the main thing I would like to press to everybody is this is truly bipartisan. And the idea is that we get fair maps, not gerrymandered maps where, looks like my daughter takes a plate of spaghetti and throws it against the wall, right? It's the idea of fair maps. And Brian and Chris can go into, there's a host of criteria that are laid out that basically discuss both protection of our minority communities, compactness. This is not just, we're going to get this commission to draw it. There's actually there are guidelines as well as how this is going to be done. But what I want to emphasize to everybody is this is a once in a decade opportunity. If this doesn't pass, and I noted this on the House floor, it's easy when you're running for office, when you sit the civic leagues and editorial boards, to say, I support redistricting reform. The hard part is actually willingly giving up power. That is a hard thing. And this passed the General Assembly, but the way it works for an amendment is you have an election, it passes one assembly and it passed with well north of 80 plus votes. Then you have to have an election, have a new state senate, a new house, and it passed. But there were a lot of people that previously voted for it that switched because they knew they had the power. And that's just, I think, the world, and both parties have been guilty of this, I want to be clear. But I think that is the hardest thing in the world. If this doesn't pass, then the system that we have, that I think we all acknowledge is broken, remains broken until 2031. That's the reality of where we're at. So I think this is the idea of getting fair maps drawn. I think it's one small step to a larger discussion of how do we bring back, I think, good governance. And I think it starts with fair maps. I really do. So my hope is that the voters of Virginia will recognize this as a great step forward. Obviously, there are always areas you can improve on anything, but what I want to emphasize is you can't make the perfect the enemy of good. I think this is a really good, a seismic opportunity for Virginia. It's really probably one of the most important things if you believe in trying to restore good government and more civility, perhaps, in our political process. I think this is a really important first step. I'll turn it over to Chris, since I know Chris is on Chris Marston as well, if he wants to talk about it in nuts and bolts. But those are kind of my my thoughts from a 80,000 feet view.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Chris.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm delighted to be here too and bring greetings from Westminster Presbyterian across Northern Virginia from you. So I am, I guess, a reformed gerrymanderer. I was involved in 2011. I worked for the Republican caucus and helped draw the map. There was no smoke in the back room, but it was a back room and there was no public there. So I've seen what it looks like to do a gerrymander from both sides and how much of a difference you can make when you have the pen. It's great if you're in power, and it's really terrible if you're not. So that's why I've gotten here to fair as a criteria. Honestly, I am a bigger fan than Brian of the way this commission is composed. I think that independent commissions that are wholly independent, like California, where they kind of pick names out of a hat, are perhaps not the best way to compose a group to draw maps. I think having the specialized knowledge of legislators and having partisans involved in the process is a useful thing. There is no objective criteria for fairness. If there were, we could just tell a computer, go draw our maps, and it would come back and we would have fair maps. But what fair means is different to many different people. There are tensions among the various criteria. Can I both protect an ethnic minority community's ability to elect the representative of its choice and make a district compact and not cross a river? Maybe, or maybe not. So someone has to make decisions to balance these things. The amendment itself lays out good criteria, and Senator McClellan's implementing legislation enhances that. So it gives these partisans the opportunity to use these criteria, but at the same time be a check on one another. If you wind up with drawing names out of a hat and you get I guess we have a 16-member commission, so if you get 10 Republicans and 6 Democrats, you're going to get a Republican gerrymander that meets the criteria. And the reverse would also be true. So I think there's a great advantage to this proposal, and I think it's among the best of the commission proposals that have been out there. I know that I'm not in line with many folks who are big supporters of the independent redistricting commission, but I think independence is something very hard to achieve. And like many things, I think a check and balance system is an appropriate one. So I'm a fan of the way this commission is composed. And I'm really glad that Brian made the point he did about the Virginia Supreme Court. Fundamentally, the justices of the court are judges and have been judges for a long time. And to use Chief Justice Roberts' analogy, they call balls and strikes. They're not, and frankly, they're not equipped in the same way that legislators are to draw a gerrymander. They don't draw maps themselves. I think most of them all know how to use legal research tools on the computer now, although I was in front of a judge who didn't the other day, and he had the clerks do it, and lamented that one side clearly didn't do it right because his clerks told him that a stop sign would show up if they cited the wrong case, and they cited the wrong case. So it was very funny. But they're not people who spend their time working on mapping software or using demographic data extensively. As most courts do, they'll employ a special master or bring in experts to help them apply these criteria in a bipartisan way, and they'll be the check. I don't think we're actually going to get there. I don't think the Supreme Court backstop is going to be something we need. We have a number of chances to get it right before it gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court really doesn't want it. They would rather not draw this. And the commission and the legislature have 2 rounds to get it right. And I think there are enough balances in place that can happen. I think the commission would have to do a terrible job for the legislature to vote down the plan, and I think it would have to be really terrible for them to do it twice. And I don't think that's going to happen. The commission is going to want to succeed. They're going to want this to go well, and there are going to be legislators on the commission who will also be in the General Assembly to advocate on behalf of the commission's plan and work with their colleagues to help them understand how they got there and why it's a fair solution. So I think that we've got a great commission proposal. I'm hopeful that everyone will support it. I have no illusions that if our party situations had been reversed, that there would be Republicans who would have switched after gaining the majority, like Democrats did when they went from the minority to the majority. I'm disappointed that the Democratic Party of Virginia has decided to oppose the amendment, but I can't say the Republican Party wouldn't have done the same thing if shoes were reversed. I speak with my own opinion, of course, not as an official representative of the party in that case. But I really do think that we have a great opportunity here. And as Jason and Brian have both noted, Virginia constitutional amendments are really, really hard. We don't just put anything on the ballot. Virginia has a very conservative government structure, and changing the Constitution is not something we do easily. So if we're going to have change, this is the time to do it. I happen to think that it's close to the optimal change, so I'm not terribly concerned about having another opportunity to change it. I know that others disagree and think that they might do better a decade from now approaching this again once we have a fairer map in place. Maybe that's true. If it is, I'm out of luck. That's the way the cookie crumbles. But I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm hopeful that the voters will agree, and I'm eager to answer any questions that you all have, as I'm sure that Jason and Brian are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to everybody. We have one more speaker whom I will introduce now. Pat Matheson is a member of our congregation who has been following this issue very closely and is here to articulate the concerns that many have about the amendment. I really want to thank Pat for stepping into the breach. I thought I had another speaker lined up, but I think there were some crossed wires. These things happen. Pandemic conditions are a little disorienting to all of us, and I think we're all a little overscheduled. So I really appreciate, I asked Pat to do this last evening, and she said yes. So that I really appreciate her doing this. And Pat, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Cathy. And I speak for myself, not for anybody else. I started out very much where our previous speakers were. When I first learned about the effort of One Virginia 21 to do an anti-gerrymandering amendment, I was all for it. I think everybody on all sides of this issue are people of goodwill trying to improve the situation. And I was pleased in 2019 when it passed. That was the first time it had to. But then learned about some of the compromises that had to be made, but I wasn't really digging in at that point. And when One Virginia 21 said, well, we don't like some of this, but it's good enough and we should not squander this opportunity, I was all in with that. I even signed up, Brian, for texting for Fair Maps. Although I wasn't very good at it, so I never actually got around to texting. But then when I discovered how partisan it had become, and even more so how the Democrats themselves were so split, the House and the Senate have taken opposite positions on this. The Senate Democrats were all in, and the House Democrats mostly not. I just wanted to know why, what was going on. So I've read as much as I could find with easy Google searches. I'm not a legislative researcher myself. And the main information that persuaded me to doubt this amendment was the actual texts of Amendment 1 and the companion legislation 1255, which sets standards and criteria for how redistricting should be done. And that is separate legislation. It doesn't rise and fall with the amendment. It came into force on July 1, and it will be in force next year, whoever does the redistricting. And it's really excellent, I think, in terms of protecting minority communities, wanting compactness and germaneness, and protecting communities of interest, incorporating the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other federal legislation and constitutional provisions. So I think whoever's doing it next year will be guided by that, and it can't get as bad as the districts that we currently have. So my main concern actually turned out to be how the makeup of the commission and how the citizen legislators are chosen. It's not an independent commission. I don't think anyone is saying it is totally independent of legislative influence, but it's more than not independent. It's really a creature of the legislature. Just to walk through a couple of nuts and bolts that I interpret from what I've read in the text, and the text is fairly clear. The Chief Justice provides names of former justices who are willing to serve as participants in a selection committee, of which there are going to be 5 on the selection committee. He provides those to the majority and minority leaders in both chambers. So the Speaker and the President pro tem and the minority leaders in both parties. They pick 4 of the members of the selection committee, and the 4 of them then pick a 5th one from the same list. So that's all coming through this legislative process. Then who can the selection committee select? Well, the same 4 leaders each provide 16 names of citizens without criteria inside the amendment, by the way, no criteria, and also no criteria in the standards and criteria. That's just on how you draw the lines. It's not how you pick the commissioners. So there's no guidance other than to say they can't be employees of the federal government or the state government or their families. So I really, and then the selection committee must select 2 names from each of those 4 lists of 16 that the majority and minority leaders have offered to the selection committee. So I don't, it's much more than they're not independent. They're a creature of the legislation. So that was very troubling to me. Then there is an issue that I do not have great insight on, and that is the opposition of the African-American, the Black caucus in the House, adamantly opposed to this because they do not think that they have a role in the process. That's really as much as I need. As I know, I've read a couple of presentations by the speaker and by Delegate Chow, what's her name, Sia Chia. And they don't really go into a lot of detail about what's wrong, but clearly they think African-American interests are not protected by this process. And the companion legislation, which is great, it doesn't get into selection of the commission. So it doesn't address that particular African-American concern. As to the Supreme Court, I've read the same things you've said about how you can't trust a Republican Supreme Court, and they are primarily Republican. I can't comment on that. I accept that most judges are probably first jurists and second partisans, but there are a lot of people who don't take that at face value. And alternatives. Yes, I definitely started out saying half a loaf is better than none, and we won't have another chance. But I've been persuaded that this flaw in the selection of the citizen commissioners should not be enshrined in the Constitution. Once this amendment is in there, nobody's going to revisit this. That's just human nature and politics, and those who are happy with it will be happy, and the others won't have a chance at yet another constitutional amendment. So I'm relying on 2 things in my own mind as to why it's okay for me to vote no, which is this companion legislation, which does set standards and criteria. It has a lot of protections, and it will, I believe, you can correct me, you experts, if I'm wrong on this, but I believe it is not dependent on the amendment passing to have force, and it will guide the legislature or whoever does it. Let's see, what was the second thing? Well, never, I don't know, lost my train of thought. Anyway, that's where I come out, that, oh, I know, that my own delegate has stated, and he was one who voted no, that because the Democrats have been so vested for the last couple of years in supporting anti-gerrymandering, they have all taken a pledge. I know a pledge is worth the piece of paper it's written on, but they feel a bit exposed, I think, if they just do an overtly Democratic gerrymander and then let it go at that. And he said, he vows that he personally is going to lead the charge in the other direction, not just for 2021, but in reopening the process, whether it is a legislatively mandated independent commission, which is independent, or whether it's another stab at doing a constitutional amendment. I do not know, and I don't think they know what they would do. But he's pledged, and other Democrats have pledged, that this is not the end of it. And so I come out that if the criteria and standards legislation governs, we'll have an okay map next year. Not perfect, but then, as we've all said, they're never going to be perfect. But that will be in place for 10 years, during which time it can become, perhaps, we hope, bipartisan again, and there can be a strenuous effort to get an actually independent commission put in place. That's it.
Thank you so much, Pat. I really, once again, appreciate, whoops, I think I'm now hearing me through you. There we go. Okay. So we will go to Q&A, and I think I will take the prerogative of doing the first question. After that, we can try, usually we just sort of do either that or raising a hand. We can try it. I think you may have a hand raising feature available over in my participants thing. I will do my best to sort of juggle everybody. But I wanted to start off with a question that Pat raised that I think is very much on many of our minds, given all that is going on in our country in the last 6 months and of course in the last 400 years, namely the question of representation for minority communities, and especially for the African American community. And I'm hoping that Brian, I think we still have Jason and or Chris could speak to that, and I'll let you sort of work that out, and then we will open it up for other questions, and I will try to see hands, and people can help me see hands if I miss any. So I don't know, Brian, Jerry, Chris, you can sort of figure out who's going to speak first, but the whole question, and I guess specifically what the chances are of good representation for the African American community with both the legislation and the amendment in place versus just the enabling legislation in place, which, as Pat pointed out, is in force as of July 1st and will certainly be part of the process either way.
Sure. And Pat, let me say, you know, while we obviously disagree on this issue, we agree. I look forward to agreeing on November 4th, no matter what happens. So thank you for stepping up and presenting those concerns, because I do think they're really valid. And it's something we shouldn't take lightly. I think they're good answers for all of them, but I'm glad you raised them. When it comes to minority representation, there's a fundamental disconnect, and it's not just for minority representation, but it's acute there. In 2011, Bob McDonald created an advisory commission, and they produced excellent maps that the legislature could have adopted, but the legislature chose not to, right? They put it all in the circular file. And Governor McDonald's commission basically had no teeth, which is unfortunate, but it did produce good maps. And one of the things it produced was a map for the House of Delegates that would have virtually guaranteed 13 African-American districts. Now that would be up one from 12, which is where we were before. And what's interesting is you would have thought that the Democrats, particularly the African-American Democrats, would have been all over demanding that we hit 13, right? Nothing less than 13 should have done. And instead, they all voted, and John Ward voted both ways on this because there was 2 different votes on it. But every member of the Legislative Black Caucus supported the map with fewer Black districts in it. And there's nothing surprising about that. White politicians do the same thing. It's just harder to see as visibly. People want safe districts. And I've heard Delegate Price say, Brian, that's not fair to use because that's the 2011 Democrats. Okay, so let's look at the 2018 Democrats. In 2018, the federal court said, these are racial gerrymandered House of Delegates districts. I think Delegate Miares, I think your district got redrawn in some of that, and we need to readjust them. Well, what happened is the court said that in early August, the federal court gave the legislature until Halloween to fix it. The Democrats get together, they come up with a plan, and that plan's a racial gerrymander too. And that's the 2018 Democrats, right? That's not 2011. These are delegates that include Sia Price, LaSharice Aird, you know, delegates that I've worked hard for to get elected and to in my free time and stuff like that. And they still did that. And Delegate Price said it best. I was listened to her talk in Albemarle, and she actually said, I watched my caucus turn into a bunch of golems. And if you don't know Lord of the Rings, it's the creature that gets possessed by the power of the ring. She said she watches her caucus turn into a bunch of golems over this, and that was 2018. So that's good people that I think are honest and sincere and I believe aligned in a lot of ways, policy-wise, but it's too much power. And so if we're going to trust that the legislature won't gerrymander again, I don't have any evidence for that. And if we're going to trust because they passed, and by the way, all those 2017 candidates ran on reform. So it wasn't like they weren't already taking the pledge, right? So if we're going to trust that, they're just going to do whatever they want. And they're going to tell you they did it fairly, but objectively we'll know it's not. And then the last part I'll say is about actual seats on the commission, because I think this is important. You can't mandate that this commission has 20% African Americans on it. You just can't. It's illegal. It will be struck down. The commission will be thrown out. But you can set up structures in place that guarantee we have a diverse commission. Because if this commission doesn't look like Virginia, we did it wrong, right? So you want diversity both in demographics and things like that, but also in geographic diversity. And I actually think the way the commission is structured, while not ideal, does actually guarantee we get that demographic and geographic diversity. Because first of all, you've got Senator Lucas, African-American state senator who strongly supports this. She'll be making directly and indirectly a quarter of the appointments to this commission. I think she's going to appoint Black and brown people. Speaker Fillercorn, the same. She's got a good track record of doing that. Now, what I think they'll miss is, I bet they're not going to appoint somebody from Roanoke. And so that's where the Republicans come in, which I don't expect a ton of diversity from that side of the aisle, but I do expect them to make sure that this commission isn't made up of people who only live in Northern Virginia. And I think that's the way you get your demographic and geographic balance through a structure.
Thank you, Brian. Do Chris or Jason, yes, have anything to add? And then I do see Pat's hand, and so we'll come back to her.
I just want to ask quickly, Brian, you didn't comment on the companion standards and criteria legislation. Will that not be governing next year? So
that's a good question. And we filed a lawsuit, you may remember in 2015, we filed over Republican gerrymandered House districts and Democratic gerrymandered Senate districts. The case is Vesselin v. State Board of Elections. And we filed a lawsuit saying that compactness is in the state constitution. And if you look at any of these districts, they're so far from compact, it's comical if it weren't somebody's voting rights. And we were bipartisan, everything you would want, and we brought it all the way up to the state Supreme Court. In the state Supreme Court, while I don't think they're partisan hacks, the thing that I do think they're very guilty of is they give Delegate Miares and his legislative colleagues way too much deference. Basically, the opinion said, yeah, it could be bad, but we're going to say that it is whatever the legislature, compactness is whatever the legislature says it is. And that's so much deference that really kind of precludes any enforcement of anything the legislature does. Because if they draw maps that say, oh, we pledge to do maps like X, and then they draw maps that are like Y, but they're going to write that they did it like X, then there's no enforcement mechanism. So there's just no way to enforce a legislative, those criteria against the legislature, including the fact that they could just repeal it with the same act of passing the maps.
I doubt they would do that between now and, middle of next year.
Pat, I would love to think that, but I had a member of the House of Delegates leadership team ask me to carry the amendment in December, and he voted against the amendment in March. We had delegates taking pictures with Dela holding a big amend sign the day before the vote saying, yeah, let's get this amendment through, and then they flipped. I just don't think our party has that much more virtue here to not flip like that.
And if I could add one thing that to piggyback on Brian, also understand this: if for some, which I do not think there's any chance of this, but if there's some map that violates the 14th Amendment, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has previously invalidated the prior map, has that same power now. That power suddenly, federal courts are a totally separate entity, and the Fourth Circuit has already shown a very open willingness to step in if they think a map is not giving proper representation. So everybody understand that the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals is still there and would still have that power to step in at any time if there is a map that doesn't have proper representation. So.
Do we have other questions? We are now open. I see John Clewett's hand.
Well, very quickly for Jason, is it not true that the federal courts, while they may step in if there is clear racial gerrymandering, will not do anything about partisan gerrymandering? Is that not the law currently according to the Supreme Court?
Maybe, Chris does a lot more election law than I do, so he could speak to that. I mean, I think what I would say is you have seen the Fourth Circuit just in the last, I guess, 3 to 4 years step in on both the federal congressional map that was drawn by the General Assembly and the House of Delegate map drawn by the General Assembly. And in both of those matters, it was primarily they struck them down based on what was viewed as improperly racial packing of districts. So, Chris, maybe you could give some thoughts of what the current status of the United States Supreme Court is on that front.
Certainly, the most recent 5-4 decision was that that partisan gerrymandering is non-justiciable. They're continuing to decline to enter the political thicket, as Justice Brandeis called it. The Constitution protects against racial discrimination. It does not protect against partisan discrimination. There are some justices who find in the Constitution protection from that, but they are not currently a majority. There are some lower federal courts that didn't really care and have still tried to strike down partisan gerrymanders. But when they've reached the Supreme Court has declined to do so. If I could just briefly touch on the issue of racial gerrymanders again, it's a very confusing historical issue. Starting in the 1990 round of redistricting, we were both required to not discriminate based on race and required to discriminate based on race. We had to draw a number of districts that would elect, where a racial minority could elect the candidate of their choice. That was essentially the mandate of the Voting Rights Act and the Justice Department at that time to pre-clear seats. We then developed a standard where you couldn't reduce the number of minority seats. So we still have many of those precedents in many of those cases. So racial gerrymandering works two ways. In Virginia, our map was struck down as being a racial gerrymander because it packed too many minority members into the same district. The allegation is that the legislature used a 55% threshold, that they had to have a 55% Black voting age population in a district to create a majority minority district. That was certainly the outcome. Whether or not that was the standard is open to dispute, but those districts were drawn that way. The court the first time said one of them was clearly a racial gerrymander, but it was okay because the Voting Rights Act said we had to do it, and the rest weren't. When it went up to the Supreme Court, they decided another decision and sent this one back on remand. The judges on the lower court changed, and they reached a different outcome and said, no, they're all racial gerrymander. You have to draw districts where minorities can elect representatives of their choice, but you can't do it too much. And there's not a standard for what's too much. It appears that 55% is too much, although there are some districts where you'd have a Black voting age population of 55% that would elect, would be less likely to elect a candidate of minority's choice because of voter registration, for example. So it's a very complicated issue. As Brian noted, you can't say there have to be X number of racial minorities on the commission. That would violate the Constitution's equal protection provisions. So it's very complicated to try and work the racial complexity issues out because of the state of the law. So I think Brian is right to have faith that there would be, the appointments would be well done by the current legislative leaders. I think the judges will be very sensitive to it as well. They'll probably be, 4 white judges and 1 African-American, because there just aren't that many African-American retired judges from the circuit courts in Virginia, but hopefully they'll do better. So the race issue is very, very complicated, and it's why we have so much litigation. We just finished litigating the 2011 lines at the end of 2018. In previous cycles, folks who practice redistricting law would have to have some other specialty to carry them through the second half of a decade. No longer. Redistricting lawyers are now fully employed for an entire decade litigating the lines drawn at the beginning of a decade. Honestly, it's quite tiresome. Changing the districts repeatedly through the course of a decade is just challenging for everybody. It hurt Republicans this time. I'm sure it's hurt Democrats other times in the most recent House of Delegates map. But it's just hard. There's a reason that we only do the census once every 10 years. It's okay for us to have malapportioned districts at the end of a decade as long as they were properly apportioned at the beginning, because we just can't do this every year. So anyway, that was me complaining and whining about how complicated this is.
And before we move on, I've just gotten the wave from definitely my better half that I need to jump off so we can scoop my daughter up and get going. But it's been an honor to be part of you. It's good to see old friends and meet new friends, as I like to say. But thanks for having me on. And for what it's worth, I say vote yes on Amendment 1. I think it's the first step towards hopefully bringing some good government and some sanity back to the process. But thanks so much for having me, guys. Okay, it's been an honor.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you for participating, Jason. That's terrific.
You. Appreciate it.
Indeed, and I think I think John has a follow-up. I see Jim has a question, Jim Edmondson. I also want to give Pat a chance if she has anything to chime in so far, since we've heard from everybody else. But
So is that to me then next, Kathy? Or
I think so, yeah. Why don't you, I assume you're following up, and then Jim Edmondson is next.
Well, yes, first of all, thank you, Kathy, for pulling this all together. I know that it is hard to organize these things. I was a little unhappy that there were 3 professional pro voices, and I think Pat Matheson did a wonderful job stepping into the breach for the other voice. I wanted to add one other voice to this. This is from an email. I cannot independently guarantee that this is accurate. I'm sure Brian Cannon will tell me if it is not. This says that a few weeks ago, Linda Perriello, a well-known anti-gerrymandering champion and former chair of One Virginia 2021, announced that she will be voting no on Amendment 1. And this is an excerpt from her statement. What emerged from the conference committee at the 11th hour of the last day of the 2019 General Assembly was an amendment that accomplished neither of the goals we had worked so hard to pass. Gerrymandering was neither mentioned nor specifically prohibited, and the quote-unquote independent commission drawing the maps would be composed of 50% politicians who in turn would have significant power to select the remaining 50% of members. General Assembly members were given less than an hour to make a decision about supporting an amendment, details of which they had neither seen nor read. Over the months following initial passage, many Democrats, especially the members of the House Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, worked valiantly to write and pass enabling legislation in the 2020 session that was supposed to, quote unquote, fix the shortcomings in the amendment. Sadly, the most important of these reforms failed to pass. These failed fixes, acknowledged by pro-reform advocates and courageously supported by Speaker Filler Korn, would have provided guardrails for who could or could not serve on the commission, explicitly prohibited gerrymandering, and provided adequate guarantees for participation by persons of color. The sad truth this all revealed is that the Richmond power brokers had done something far more insidious than defeat fair districts. They had consolidated power and done it in a way that got them accolades for advancing quote unquote reform. After devoting 8 years of my life to ending partisan gerrymandering, I will sadly vote no on the amendment this November. I believe that the current amendment is not a partial victory, but a roadblock to real reform that still must come in the years ahead. We can start again with a good amendment next year while pressing the current majority to draw maps as close to our original principles as possible. As for the amendment Virginia needs and deserves, we already have it written and waiting for fair consideration. So that's a statement from Linda Perriello, who was apparently the former chair of One Virginia 2021. I don't know if Brian may want to confirm that that's if that is the case.
She is, and I'd love to respond, but I see Pat's got her hand up. I don't know if there's, I don't want to monopolize here.
So thank you, John. That was extremely helpful. And my better half here reminded me of a point I didn't raise, which is one of the speakers said, well, the commission will be invested in this, whatever the makeup, and they're not going to spin out maps that are obviously gerrymandered and terrible that are going to get rejected. So the chances of this ending in the Supreme Court is low. But in an effort to have balance between the two parties and to force compromise, they've required that 6 out of 8 of each half of this commission vote yes on the whole map, the whole state. You can't just do it district by district. And so that what that really means is it only takes 2 no votes from one party or from one chamber. And it will end up twice, yes, I agree with it, they have a second chance, but it will end up in the Supreme Court, which has no obligation to start from the work that the commission had already done. They have a blank slate. The text of the amendment simply says, if the commission and the legislature don't get it done, then the Supreme Court will draw the lines, period. I've posted the text of the amendment as it passed and of this standards and criteria legislation. My homework assignment for anyone who really wants to make up their own mind would be just read the texts. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. And Jim has been very patient. Also, I think I found what John read and posted that link. I'm pretty sure.
Cathy, could I correct some factual inaccuracies in what John
then,
read? Not that he read it wrong, but there's some misstatements there.
Certainly. Go ahead, and then we will go to Jim.
Sure. So I have a lot of respect for Linda Perriello. She's just wrong on this. She's not a redistricting expert, though she's been an amazing volunteer and supporter for this cause. And I think, you know, there are really genuinely good people, and Pat, I consider you and this too, who just think this isn't enough and we can get better, and that's fine. I will tell you that there are a lot of other delegates who oppose this amendment and use the same rhetoric that Pat, you do, and Linda does sincerely, but they use it insincerely. And because they've told me privately, hey, it's just our turn to gerrymander Republicans. They can get, you know, it's our turn to, and I can't abide by that from this. Here's what happened on the enabling legislation. And I think it's really illustrative and where Linda is completely wrong. And I hate saying that, but it's just factually incorrect. The enabling legislation package was something that Democrats had all agreed upon in the Senate and the House. They almost all voted for it. And they even got Republican votes for it as well. So it was pretty bipartisan in general. And we certainly think it's important. And there were several elements to it. And in two of the elements, there was a one-word change, like a must to a shall, and then another one was an extra line that the Department of Legislative Services asked for regarding prison gerrymandering. It wasn't substantive, it was administrative. So so when both chambers passed it the final time, they passed it and sent it to conference committee to work out those two little details. And usually what happens on a conference committee is the Senate appoints 3 and the House appoints 3. 2 from the majority party of each chamber and 1 from the minority party of each chamber. And you usually appoint the people who had the bill, right? So in this case, for the Democrats in the House, they appointed Schuyler Van Valkenburg, the delegate from Henrico, who had the enabling legislation. But instead of appointing just one more Democrat and then one Republican, Speaker Fillercorn did something tricky here. She appointed 2 more Democrats. She appointed Delegate Price and Delegate Simon. And instead of everybody getting together and just agreeing like, hey, let's make these 2 changes, Delegate Price and Delegate Simon blew up the whole deal. They took it and said, we will not agree to this. We will not agree to this at all. This is right after the floor vote on the amendment. So there was a lot of ill will and hard feelings. They're like, we want this completely new other thing that they just pulled out of thin air that was actually not very good. And they want this to be an automatic commission that would go into effect if the amendment is voted down. So basically they were asking to play politics with the enabling legislation to do it. And they were willing to do that and sacrifice the enabling legislation, thinking if this doesn't work out, we'll just come back in special session in the summer and fix it. Then COVID hit, here we are. There is a special session now. So if the legislature wants to add it, they can add that language into the budget today. But what's interesting is you're not gonna see that in the House of Delegates budget. And so to say that party insiders sunk this is really wrong. And it's just, I'm disappointed in Linda for putting that out there and having it be repeated so often, but it is just factually not true. It was opponents of the amendment sinking this for political gain.
Thank you, Brian. And Jim Edmondson has been extremely patient, and I want to make sure that he gets to ask his question. So, hi, Jim. And make sure to unmute you need to unmute yourself, and you should be able to, yeah. Okay, I at least am not getting sound from you. It's very garbled. Maybe you could try typing into the chat and I can read it. Are others hearing Jim? Jim, we're not getting your sound. Could you type your...
Jim has a loose helium tank in the house.
Yeah. Could you type your question into the chat and we'll get it that way? I apologize. Zoom has tech issues sometimes.
May I just ask a follow-up question of Brian on his comments about Linda?
Yeah, Jim, you could also dial in with a phone line. Pat Buzz is putting out. So you might want to try that. So John, why don't you ask your follow-up quickly, and Jim, see if you can dial in on the phone. Maybe that will solve it.
So it sounded as though Brian was taking issue with what Linda said about the process, but was not taking issue with her statement that the amendment didn't accomplish the goals that had originally been set, that it didn't prohibit gerrymandering and was not an independent commission.
Oh, I do take issue with that. I was just trying to be concise. Yeah, John, what I'll say is if Linda was looking for the word gerrymandering in the amendment, it's not in there. And it wasn't even in the gold-plated version of what we proposed. Because you can't say don't gerrymander, because that doesn't mean anything legally. What it does is this amendment eliminates partisan gerrymandering, because you have to get buy-in from both parties, significant buy-in from both parties on this commission operating in a transparent way. So you just can't have a Republican or Democratic gerrymander. It's not going to happen. And so the structure of this prohibits that. And that's what I think that Linda's wrong in that regard. Is it everything we want? Absolutely not. But you know, if you're looking at folks to find out who's saying this is a step forward versus who's saying this is not, and who's saying this is a step forward that enables a future step forward, you've got all the experts and all the good government groups in the country on one side saying yes, and you've got a lot of Democratic delegates running the show on the other side. And I do think there's some really good folks that genuinely just disagree, and that's fine. But a lot of those delegates who are on the board of the Vote No group have told me they want a gerrymander. So, you know, it's hard to really take it with a straight face there. And I think Linda's sadly mistaken.
Thank you.
And-
Sorry,
and
I'm trying to.
senators. Not just delegates, Democratic senators also. Scott Surville,
Oh.
for example.
Sure, there's plenty of Democratic senators with a problem here, but Scott Surville's not wasting any time or effort on this issue either, if you notice, right? He's not engaged in the Vote No campaign.
So I just resent Jim. I don't know whether you've had any chance to try tech, or is it any better? Okay, we're getting no sound now. And now we're back to. Yeah, we're not getting it. I just resent the email that has the phone-in link. So if you want to try that, it should be early up in your email box. Yeah, it's just not coming through at all. Give it a moment. Anybody else have a question? If not, I do, but and then we'll come back to Jim. I was curious, one thing reading through this, and I, you know, have done a modicum of homework, but not a tremendous amount. I think, and this may be the scholar talking, there seems to be, one of the questions is how much we will know about what actually happened under either just having the enabling legislation versus having both the amendment and the enabling legislation. I think one of the arguments I'm seeing is that having the amendment would make things more transparent, that we'd have a clearer record of what happened, and be able to have a clearer sense of, you know, what we need to improve or not. I'd be interested in comments on that from anybody. That seems like a plus, or arguments that it's in fact not more transparent with the amendment than without.
Cathy, this is Chris. I'm sure Brian will have some insights, but I think I have a useful historical perspective on this. Everything that the commission does would have to be done in open meetings, and they would have to vote publicly on every proposal, and everybody would have a chance to talk. In 2011, I was not a legislative staffer. I was hidden in a little room off-site, and delegates would creep over and come see me, and I'd plug things into the computer. And every once in a while, we'd go over to the House of Delegates office building, and some Democrats would come in and see Chris Jones, who was the lead patron, and he would work out little things that would make them happy about their own districts to try and pull votes in. That's how he got the whole Black Caucus in, and several other Democrats. Someone mentioned Senator Surville, who at the time was a delegate. He was one who came over with Vivian Watts and some Northern Virginia delegates and worked out how they wanted to divvy up Fairfax County so they could all get on board. And no one ever saw any of that except for me, because I was sitting in the corner at the computer making it happen. And the only thing that happens is Privileged in Elections says, look, here's our bill. It appeared from magic. And they ran around the state and said, let's have a public hearing. Tell us what a great job we did, or tell us you hate us. We don't really care. We're going to go back to Richmond and pass it anyway. So we gathered public input. Sure we did. And then it went to the House floor, and there was debate, as there is on any bill. But the construction of the map was not done in any sort of public way. And I don't think that the legislature will ever do it in a public way. And they're the only ones who can make themselves be transparent. And how long has it taken to get House subcommittee video streaming? I don't know the number of years, much less recorded votes in subcommittees. So I have no confidence, based on my personal experience, that there is any possibility of a transparent process inside the legislature. So I think the amendment, whether the enabling legislation passes or not, it is a much better chance at transparency. So if someone's going to engage in gerrymandering, at least we'll know it while they're doing it. So that's my view historically on the difference in transparency.
Yeah, I'll just add that the problem is the status quo, right? Like we can debate whether we want more reform or that, and Chris, actually appreciate your honesty that you're like, this is all the reform I want. But the status quo currently gives the power to the legislature to draw districts in the Constitution, and the status quo gives legislative privilege to those legislators while drawing those districts. So we filed a lawsuit to unlock the Democratic Senate gerrymander documents from 2011, and the Supreme Court of Virginia said, nope, they get to protect them. The Senate Democrats don't have to turn over any documentation to us. So this amendment would force open data and open meetings, and at least we could be good watchdogs on it. And quite frankly, even if all the commissioners are bad actors and they're super partisan, at least being able to have a lot of sunlight in there and being able to call them on what they're doing is a step forward. It's certainly not everything I want, but I think even if the commission as a structure doesn't have a bunch of saints on it, then at least they have to act in good faith. And what you see in other states where they've had these kind of hybrid partisan or hybrid political commissions like this is that they produce better maps too. And you don't have to trust my word. You can look at Yuri Radinsky at the Brennan Center for Justice has written on this, and he's a big supporter of it as well, and also would tell you exactly what I just told you about the political commissions. He's actually from Washington, so they have one of those as well.
Cathy, you're on mute.
Anybody want to weigh in on that? And then I think we have Jim on a different link, and then I also see Phil and or Connie's hand. Jim, you want to give it a try on your new connection? You need to unmute.
Cathy, if you press the Ask Unmute button, it'll pop a link up for Jim to unmute himself.
Okay.
Can I do that in the participant window?
Okay, let me see.
How about this? Does that
We
work?
got you. Excellent, and we
Oh.
can hear you. Hurrah.
Well, for some reason, it wasn't working on one computer, but it is on an iPad. Okay. I'm sorry. During the entire discussion, I have not heard specific reference, obviously it's underlying, to the number of competitive districts that might exist. We hear, for example, that in the entire country of the 435 House of Representative districts, maybe 30 are competitive. I don't know what the same applies to 140 districts in Virginia, but it's probably pretty small. Is there some objective way, maybe academics looking at it could tell us that if the number of districts that are non-competitive get below a certain level, a certain percentage factor, then we've got to change. There's got to be a change. And I don't understand why we have to wait every 10 years to make those kinds of changes, given how quickly some the demographics in districts might change. I know that Chris said earlier that making changes frequently is really difficult, but I guess the more significant issue is in the question is, isn't there some standard about non-competitive districts that we ought to be looking at in making judgments about making changes?
It's
I'll
really,
throw
that's
that
a
up
good
to
question.
anyone who wants.
I'm happy to, Jim, that's a really good question, because I think people are frustrated by the lack of competitiveness. Let me suggest that redistricting reform doesn't completely solve that, right? You could have great redistricting reform in Virginia or other states, and you're still going to have a ton of blue districts in Northern Virginia and a ton of red districts in Southwest Virginia. In fact, to not have competitive, or to get competitive, you'd have to draw little snake-like districts outside of Alexandria that would loop all the way down to, Botetourt County. And so that's not, there's no real measure for that. What I will say is, if you look at the congressional districts, which I think are a good example kind of around the country, if you look at the congressional districts, and in I think it was 2016, but maybe it was 2018, we had a doubling of those like 35 competitive. It got up to like 70 competitive districts. And there's an academic standard of within 10 points between the two, that's considered competitive. I think that's a pretty generous standard, but sure. And then if you look at just those seats that were competitive and you see where they come from two places. They come from states that had reform, and I include those like political hybrid commission states as well. States that had reform and states that had court-drawn redistricting like Virginia did for our congressional districts. So you don't see it from one party controlling the other, but you do see it in places, even if they only have modest reform, you see more competitive districts.
Brian makes an excellent point about the sort of geographic distribution of districts. There are some folks, and this is one of the arguments that underlies the partisan gerrymandering cases, who think that the correct answer is a map that reflects the partisan composition of the state. So if your state elections are usually 55-45 Democrat Republican, then your House of Delegates should come out the same way. I'm not a believer in that proposal. I think if we want proportional representation, that's a conversation we can have. We should eliminate districts and vote for statewide lists if proportional representation is what we want. Personally, I don't like that. I like districts. But one of the consequences of having districts and choosing standards like being contiguous and compact and reflecting communities of interest is you're not going to have competitive districts everywhere. Brian made a joke, but I actually, as a fun experiment with my friends up in Northern Virginia, figured out how to get Alexandria into a Republican district. And let me tell you, that would have been ugly. We had to pass the Occoquan. The 9th Congressional District of Virginia is never going to be a Democrat district again. There's no way to get enough Democrats in there to unseat Morgan Griffith. Likewise, the 8th District, which is currently a D+33 up here in Northern Virginia, you just can't do it. There's no way to make some places competitive just because of the way the population has segregated itself geographically. So if you want competitiveness as a standard, you have to decide what else you're going to give up. And that's the trade-off you make with any standard that you choose to apply in the redistricting context. There's always a trade-off. And that's why I made a comment earlier that there is no fair. There's no definition of fair that can be universally agreed to that we could give a computer to do this for us. I think competitive districts are more fun. You know, I'm a political consultant and a treasurer, so I'm going to make a lot more money if there's more competitive districts. I'm not going to complain about that. But it's just something that you have to trade something to get there.
Thank you very much. Pat, did you have any thoughts on that, or Jim, did you have any follow-up? And you will have to unmute again. I'm sorry. Okay.
No, I think I did get the text of the amendment and the standards and criteria legislation on the chat now. So
we have a lot of good things in the chat on both sides, and I'm trying to save that regularly. We'll try to save it at the end, and if anybody wants it, I will happily send it out so that we have that available. So I am seeing a hand from Phil and/or Connie Church.
Yeah, hi, Kathy. First of all, thanks so much for organizing this. And can you hear me okay? Yeah, this is Phil. Question for Chris and Brian. In addition to, well, whatever course the redistricting reform legislation takes, there's two other trends out there that I think should have some impact on the process. One is the 2020 census and what we learned from that. And secondly, the growing Hispanic Latino populations in Virginia. I'd be curious to know how those two developments are likely to inform the process. I'm thinking particularly of the fact that, for example, Speaker Eileen Filler-Corn has opposed the amendment largely because it fails to take into account the inclusion of communities of color on the commission. I realize that's a pretty slippery slope when you're trying to get representation, ethnic representation on a commission. But I'd be curious to know how these other factors that are out there are likely to play into this reform process.
So let me just jump in on the census. The census is a mess, and it's a mess regardless of whether we do the amendment or we don't, right? And it's a real tragic moment that we can't get this right. It wasn't like the Trump administration was like conducting a census with flying colors, and then you have COVID, and then like no matter how good they were doing it before, you just can't. So it's a mess, and I'm worried about that. But that problem, while it impacts, is not dependent on how we redistrict. So there's we could get into the census more if you want, but let me address the other side on what Speaker Fillercorn says, because I think it's ironic that she says that, because under this amendment, she would get to appoint, directly or indirectly, a quarter of the commission. And if she wanted to appoint Black and brown voices to that, and I would hope she would, and I know she would, right? I've known her since I worked for Mark Warner. She could do that, right? So there's structural guarantees to get that there. But if you're really talking about how emerging minority communities can get together and actually talk about their community in a way to keep it from being divided up. What I'll say is that the good example to take is California, right? California's plenty Democrat, plenty diverse, and yet when they got reform, all of a sudden you saw this huge uptick in minority and women candidates winning elections. And by the way, Jim, to your point, also competitive districts. You see this huge uptick of that. And the reason is not because somehow this like gave them some advantage. It's just the people in charge were not as diverse as the people they were representing. And the people in charge were keeping that down because they were drawing districts that were reflecting their reelection strategy, not some sort of community mapping. So what Cathy Fung from Common Cause, she was Common Cause director in California. Now she's their national redistricting person. What Cathy said, she also has endorsed the amendment, by the way. She said that these communities, because it was a transparent process with citizen engagement and all that stuff, they were actually able to get communities together to start mapping together. So you have, Latino groups with African American groups and Korean groups having a conversation, right? Because apparently Koreatown in LA doesn't actually have a majority of Koreans anymore, right? Like things that, whatever, but the politicians were still drawing maps to reflect their previous reelection strategy. And so you get a better shot at those kind of representations going forward. And I drew maps in 2011 as a student in law school, and drew a likely Latino influence district in Northern Virginia for the House of Delegates, and no one would have listened. No one listens to that because it went through the political meat grinder, and folks went in Chris's office to say, oh, I need this and I need that, and the Latino community got carved up 7 ways to Sunday.
So if I could add briefly to Brian's notes, one thing that regardless of whether or not we have the enabling legislation or the amendment, the Voting Rights Act is still out there, and there are lots and lots of plaintiffs prepared to sue over a map. So if whoever draws the map doesn't take into account things like representation of minority groups, we're going to go to court and the court's going to redraw the maps. That's not the good way to do it. That's the wrong way to do it. It's much better to plan ahead, have a group that takes all these factors into account and isn't being second guessed by a court on one particular topic, so a court draws a remedial plan that fixes that one thing but might break other stuff. The very first thing that I did when I was helping with redistricting in 2011 was I went to the clerk's office and got a list of the home addresses of every legislator, and I plugged them into my map because I knew the one thing that would sink my plan for sure is if I took out an incumbent without intending to. Apologies to Ward Armstrong. So a commission.
Just for the record, Chris moved his district from Martinsville to Loudon.
I mean, the population shifted. We happened to draw him into another district. It wasn't my idea. I just worked for them. But if you start with incumbent protection, which is in fact a traditional redistricting principle that's recognized by courts, then you're going to wind up with a very different map. I don't think a commission is going to apply that as a traditional redistricting principle. I think that the history of it as a redistricting principle was in the federal legislature because people didn't want to give up their seniority in the House. So Texas was happy when it was able to chair every committee. So their traditional redistricting principle was keep all our incumbents so we can chair all the committees. That doesn't apply as much on the state level, but it's certainly something that is contemplated in redistricting plans, and it's something that warped our map. In fact, the reason why, one of the reasons why Brian couldn't get traction on a Latino influence map is because it was right next to a place where I could have drawn a district that encompassed 5 Republican incumbents. I had to protect all 5 of those Republican incumbents who all lived within a geographic area that could have been a single district. So I had to go grab stuff nearby for all of them to take it in. And that rejiggered the Fairfax map so that I couldn't get a minority influence district, which I very much wanted to do to protect my map from litigation. We tried, and the closest we got was it was a non-white majority district. So between African Americans and Latinos, there were more of them than there were whites in the district. It wound up electing a white delegate anyway. It was not a very politically engaged area, and it had low voter turnout. So there's a lot of things that go into to competitiveness and districts, and I can't emphasize enough how complicated this whole thing is. If it were easy to draw fair maps, it's possible that some virtuous legislators would have done it. Unlikely, as Brian will tell you, but possible. But it's just really hard. I hope all of you will volunteer to serve on the commission, and that a circuit court judge will say, he's the guy, and put you on so you can see what it's like, because it really is an interesting adventure, regardless of what your goals are at the end, to see how you put one of these things together and how you manage all the information about demographics and political competitiveness and geography. If you look at Virginia, Virginia's map, and its counties and cities in particular, they're very influenced by strange historical things, and they're funny shapes. It's Manassas Park. Who should you keep them with? Should you keep them with Manassas, or should you split them? Are they really one community of interest, or are they two? We have all the rivers that are the defining characteristic of our Eastern geography. When is it okay to cross a river? When is it not? How big a separation does that river create between people on the south side and the north side of the river? Is the James a bigger deal than the Rappahannock? There's a lot that goes into this that makes it very complicated. So enough, I'll get off my high horse.
I'm seeing John's hand. Anybody else? John? I'm seeing Ray. Why don't we give Ray a turn and then we'll come back to John, since John has spoken.
Yes, this has been very fascinating. Thank you very much, because I'm torn. I think I'm less torn now than I was an hour and a half ago. Thank you for everything. Brian, you made reference, I think, twice to some other states that have addressed the gerrymandering issue and have chosen what you called a hybrid. I assume by hybrid you meant some sort of commission that included some legislators and some non-legislature citizens. Could you say a little more about those cases and whether we have enough information about how they have worked or not worked to sort of identify the upside and risks of going with what we have in our amendment now, which is what I think you would characterize as one of these hybrids?
Yeah, so that's a good question. They really vary a lot, right? Like Washington State has I think it's 3 commissioners, and they're all indirect, or they're all direct appointments by the legislature. So if you just had if we had, Speaker Fillercorn directly appointing 2 people to serve on the commission, that's not much better than just having her there, right? So it's there. So a lot of those hybrids are either have politicians on them directly or have direct appointments of those politicians, in which case I kind of think that's the same, right? That's why I think the indirect appointment method we have in our process is, while it's not everything I want, it's much better. And just the way I would think about it like this is that you have to find each of those 4 legislative leaders, so Eileen Fillercorn, Louise Lucas, Tommy Norment, and Todd Gilbert, have to recommend 16 people at least who have some sort of, there's some filters out there in the amendment itself, and there's others the Democrats could add right now if they wanted to further make these folks further away from the process. But you have to get 16. And the way I think about it like this, if I was going to conspire to do something nefarious, I probably have a few buddies who would help me, but I don't have 16 buddies who would help me. And that was one of the fights that we won in the last minute, was the proposal didn't have a minimum, the amendment didn't have a minimum number of appointees that they had to recommend to the judges. They had no minimum, and we were like, we want 24, and they settled on 16. And so that's 64 people. I think that's pretty good, and I hope that gets us better. But what you do have is a lot of data on all of those states that have those political commissions, because they've actually been in place for a while. And what you see is not as good as California got, but you do see significantly better. You also see significantly less litigation over it, because it's kind of done in an open bipartisan way. So there are improvements to be had there. I would say that Yuri Radinsky at the Brennan Center is probably the best resource for all of that on this as well.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, anybody else want to weigh in on that question? Otherwise, we will go to John.
So I have a sort of two questions. One is for Dela, if I am not mispronouncing your name. There was a list of organizations that were said to be in support of this, and one of them was the Brennan Center. I did a quick little search, and all I can find at the Brennan Center is an overview that they characterize as informational and not to be construed as implying endorsement by the Brennan Center for Justice. So Dela, if you have a link to anything that says that the Brennan Center did in fact endorse Amendment 1, I'd be interested in seeing that. And then for Brian, you had said that the structure of the commission would make it difficult for there to be a Republican gerrymander or a Democratic gerrymander, but along the lines of the process that Chris has been describing of incumbent protection, would it not be possible or even likely that there would be what you might call a bipartisan gerrymander? So we would still see districts that were not the sort of thing that would be drawn by a computer that was looking for compact districts that followed geographical lines and the like, but it would be a bipartisan gerrymander with a bunch of funny looking districts so that the whole set of current leaders are protected as opposed to the interests of the people. So it would still be the politicians selecting their voters.
So I think we had, Brian may have answered the question to Dela, but I want to let Dela answer separately if.
Shared in the chat. Thank you for asking. Brian posted the link to the article, and then I just posted a quick snippet quoting where they called the amendment important and necessary to pass.
Okay, your sound isn't great, but I think we got it, and you both posted some replies in the chat, it sounds like. So I think we got that. Brian, did you?
Yeah, John, ask anybody at the Brennan Center, they support it. They've been on Zoom calls like this with me before and talking about their support for this. So I mean, maybe they haven't issued a formal press release. They don't really do that a lot, but I did send you Michael Lee's stuff, and Michael Lee and Yuri and all of those are the kind of gurus on redistricting for the Brennan Center for Justice. So they have in that regard. I'm now blanking on the other question because I was thinking about Michael. What was it, John?
John, you're on mute.
The other was, well, first off, that is just an opinion piece by the fellow that you cited. I just went to it real quick, but sure, rather than an official endorsement by the Brennan Center. But the other question was about whether the amendment would allow a bipartisan gerrymander.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question, John. And so here's what I think, and I don't want to overpromise on the amendment, because I actually think that we should be very clear about what this amendment does and what it needs to, what improvements we need in the long run. The amendment eliminates partisan gerrymandering. structurally, it just isn't going to get through. You're not going to get through a Republican map. You're not going to get through a Democratic map. You might get through something, that you could get something through in the middle, and it might lean one way or another, but it's certainly not going to be on the outliers like what we've seen in previous years. So partisan gerrymandering goes away. And racial gerrymandering, which is far too often the history in Virginia's court, and Chris illuminated some of the reasons why it is, but there's also some incumbent protection and nefariousness in that too. Racial gerrymandering would be illegal under the Virginia Constitution for the first time in 401 years. That's pretty significant. And it's a little belt and suspenders at the moment because there is the 14th Amendment and the Federal Voting Rights Act, but the interpretations of those at the courts have changed. So I think it's incumbent upon us as Virginians to make sure racial gerrymandering is illegal under Virginia's Constitution, even if that's belt and suspenders at the moment. But what this doesn't do is eliminate all sorts of insider deals that could be made. And that's my big concern. That's why I want to make sure the citizens are as independent as possible, so that they would have to give to it. But I do think that that's where the transparency piece comes into it, John, is that if they want to make those trade-offs, if they want to include their mom in their district or whatever it is that they're looking to do, or draw out their primary opponent, they would have to do it in the open. And I think that shame, while doesn't rule politicians, shame goes a long way in getting us there. So I don't think the amendment fully does that. I wish it would. I think that's one of the improvement parts. So ends partisan gerrymandering, makes racial gerrymandering illegal in Virginia, and we've still got work to do on what I would call political gerrymandering, though I think the transparency puts us in the right step on that.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to, I'm sorry,
Go
Kathy.
ahead. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah,
just 2 notes on what Brian said. It's really true that there are legislators that made us draw lines to include their mother in their district. This goes back to the fairness point that I've tried to reemphasize. There is no way to get to something that prohibits all bad things for all time. There's not a consensus or agreement on what universal fairness would be. Is a bipartisan gerrymander a bad thing? If you think all districts should be competitive, absolutely it's a bad thing. Is competitiveness the most important thing for you? Then it's definitely bad. But if you think it's more important that a person represent the community that they're from and have ties to it, and the districts be compact and contiguous and reflect a community of interest, then you have to live with non-competitiveness, and that might constitute a bipartisan gerrymander for some people. So defining the terms is a real challenge, and it's hard to get to anything that everyone will agree is fair, or any commission or other structural proposal that's going to guarantee that we won't have the following 17 bad things that are bad in my view. So for whatever that's worth.
Great, thank you. So we are coming up on, and I would note also that my guess is that many mothers are very effective campaigners and networkers. So it may not be just sentimentality, but practicality to want one's mom in the district. I can see why that might be the case. We are coming up on 10 minutes of to the hour, and I want to respect everybody's time, both our speakers and just the fact that there is a limit to how much all of us can Zoom. But I do want to first of all see if there are any final questions. Okay, I see one more from Phil and or Connie. Maybe Connie this time.
Yeah, this is a comment more than anything. Chris said that having absolute if the population is 55% one party and 45% the other, he wouldn't want absolute parity there. And I think probably most of us agree. But let's say that the population, for argument's sake, is 55% Democratic and 45% Republican. But as we've seen in many states, you've got 13 congressional districts, and 9 or 10 of them are only going to elect Republicans. When you've got 55% Democrats, that's obviously gerrymandered. So anything we can get to closer to parity, and who knows, maybe a strongly Democratic district might say, ooh, this Republican is really good, and vote for him anyway.
Thank you. I don't object to parity happening. you know, if it winds up being 55-45, super. I object to some of the structural mechanisms that would force it. So just to make that distinction, if it happens to come out that way and you also meet the other goals you want in terms of compactness or contiguity or communities of interest, that's great. I just don't think that it's appropriate to force it and have it be a redistricting criteria. So if the 2020 presidential election reveals a 55-45 state, then we must draw districts that elect 55 Democrats and 45 Republicans to the General Assembly. If we were electing, you know, if the legislature wound up 30-70, that would absolutely be clear evidence that there was something that had gone wrong. But I'm not sure what the structural way to ensure that that can't possibly ever happen in any way. For example, you know, there isn't a reasonable example I can think of, but you know, if it turned out that by some strange coincidence, 15 Republicans were convicted of felonies during the election season and dropped out, and those districts elected Democrats, well then, yeah, you're not going to have balance. So obviously that's a silly example, but there are examples short of that I think could produce an odd outcome. So hope that helps.
I'm seeing Jim's hand. Make sure to unmute. I don't think we got it yet.
Oh, I got it.
Excellent.
Sorry. Just an observation about competitive districts. I would personally never anticipate that we'd have universally competitive districts or trying to achieve some mix. My thought is that if it was a criterion that sort of entered the lexicon and the basis for change, that you would expect that there would be a greater percentage of competitive districts than exist now, but nothing like across the board competitiveness. That is just unachievable, I think, either as a logistical possibility or a goal.
Brian, I think you would agree with me that that it's certainly going to be the case there will be more competitive districts after a map drawn by a commission than after a map drawn by the legislature.
Yeah, no place to go but up, right? It's a low bar, but yes.
So, any more questions or any final thoughts? Pat, I want to give you a chance since you haven't as much airtime, although I know John has also very ably represented some of the concerns, so I appreciate that. Okay, I'm seeing a wave no. So any other final thoughts from anybody else? I guess our speakers, Brian.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all for this discussion. The fact that we're able to have this discussion and engage so deeply at this level is what lets me know that we'll get more reform later. It's not some pinky promise from a legislator that's going to tell us this, but it's the fact that you guys are willing to give up a couple hours on a Saturday morning to nerd out with us. So I really appreciate that, and thank you, Cathy, and for facilitating all this. And the thing I would say is that the trust us on the Democratic side that we get from the Democratic legislators is tough to stomach for me. And I'm a Democrat. I wish we could. But if you look at what they've done, even in 2018, when they had the chance, the court gave them the chance. There's a bunch of new legislators. They'd all promised to do fair redistricting going forward. They campaigned on it. Some of them got elected on it. Wendy Goditis out in beat Randy Minshew on this issue because Minshew had flip-flopped on it, and she hammered him on it. So some of them had run that. And then what did the House Democrats do? They did the same thing that they did in 2011 with Chris, except they did it within their own team. And they turned out these maps that were just as bad of a racial gerrymander as it was before. And I just can't, I was so disheartened by that. They could have held public meetings. They could have had a transparent process. They still haven't even admitted who drew the lines for the House Democrats in 2018, because the Republicans grilled them on it because they had a field day thinking, well, finally the Democrats are showing their hypocrisy on this too. I'm going to put a link in the chat to Moon Duchin's report at Tufts University, where she analyzed the various Republican plans and the Democratic plans presented in that 2018 session. And I think what you'll see, and there's a little graph for it, it took me a little while to understand her mathematical jargon there, but what you'll see is that Democrats proposed a racial gerrymander too. And I don't want that to happen again. I don't trust the Democrats to not do an incumbent protection plan. I don't trust the Republicans to not do an incumbent protection plan. And that screws over minority communities. But I do trust that we can get citizens, we can get this at least half independent commission, which is better than the status quo. We can get minority community protections for the first time ever in our state constitution. And God, I just can't overstate how powerful transparency is in this process. And we'll get that too. It's not everything I want, but it is surely better than what we have currently.
Well, thank you.
I just want to say thank you. I enjoyed this very much, and I hope that it was informative for all of you.
Thank you. And I do appreciate both the high sort of thoughtfulness and cooperativeness level and the high nerd level of this conversation. Eva, I'm hoping that's a clap rather than a question. I think that's a clap. Okay. So thank you for coming too. We have a couple of people we haven't heard from, but we were glad to have them there. So thank you to everybody. I will save the chat. I did record. It goes into a Lewinsville staff member's account, so it will take us a little while to sort of figure out how all that works. We will probably have it posted somewhere on the website that may not be tremendously obvious. So if you would like to a link to the recording, email me and I will figure out how to get it there. It will be available, but probably not tremendously highlighted. So we'll figure that out. So thank you everybody for coming. Have a good rest of the day. Good luck with figuring out how you're going to vote on this. This may be the more challenging one for many of us compared to other things on the ballot. And vote, and probably vote as early as possible. I think everybody would agree is wise this year. So I think that's a nonpartisan statement, I hope. So thank you very much, everybody. I will let you go and make sure I'm saving everything before I depart myself.
Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. Thank you all.